The expected news was just happened. British Prime Minister Keir Starmer has just concluded a visit to China that marks a defining moment in the shifting landscape of global diplomacy, and the implications are reverberating across Western capitals at this very hour. What unfolded in Beijing over recent days represents the latest confirmation of a pattern that has been building momentum, a pattern in which traditional allies of the United States are openly exploring alternatives to Washington's partnership in ways that would have seemed unthinkable just months ago. The visit has produced concrete agreements, tangible commitments, and a signal to the world that the established order of international relations may be entering a new and uncertain phase. This development arrives as British officials announce that Starmer has secured specific gains from his discussions with Chinese leadership. Among the outcomes now confirmed are 30-day visa-free access for British citizens traveling to China and reduced tariffs on whiskey exports from Britain. These are not theoretical promises or vague commitments to future cooperation. They are immediate, practical results that will take effect in the coming period. Alongside these government-to-government agreements, British pharmaceutical company AstraZeneca has unveiled a $15 billion investment commitment in China, a sum that underscores the scale of economic engagement that continues to bind Western corporations to the Chinese market despite rising geopolitical tensions. The manner in which this information has emerged reflects the carefully managed nature of high-level diplomatic visits. Official statements from both British and Chinese authorities have confirmed the agreements reached during the trip. The details have been released through established channels, with government spokespeople and official media outlets providing the framework for how these developments are being presented to domestic and international audiences. What remains consistent across these various sources is the confirmation that Starmer's visit has produced outcomes that Beijing is now highlighting as evidence of China's role as what it terms a reliable partner in global affairs. To understand the significance of what has just occurred, it is necessary to place this visit within the broader context of diplomatic activity that has been unfolding since the beginning of the current U.S. administration's second term. Starmer's journey to Beijing follows a similar visit by Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney, who traveled to China weeks earlier and secured expectations of a trade agreement. Carney subsequently appeared at the World Economic Forum in Davos, where he spoke about the emergence of what he described as a new global trade order. European leaders have also made their way to Beijing in recent months, as has Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi. The pattern is clear, and it is accelerating. Western and non-Western leaders alike are engaging directly with Chinese leadership at a moment when relations with Washington have become strained over a range of issues. The visits are taking place against the backdrop of significant pressure that the Trump administration has been applying to long-standing allies. From demands regarding Greenland to insistence on renegotiating the USMCA trade agreement among the United States, Canada, and Mexico, the current U.S. administration has demonstrated a willingness to challenge established partnerships in ways that have created uncertainty among governments that have historically aligned themselves with Washington. From the perspective of capitals such as London and Ottawa, the visits to Beijing serve a dual purpose. They provide an opportunity to explore economic cooperation with the world's second-largest economy, but they also send a message to Washington that alternatives exist if pressure from the United States continues to intensify. However, what is less certain at this stage is the extent to which these visits will translate into substantial long-term economic and security benefits for the Western powers undertaking them. Observers of international affairs have noted that while the symbolism of these high-level meetings is significant, the practical outcomes may prove more limited than the public messaging suggests. According to statements from experts in global strategy, traditional U.S. allies are clearly seeking to hedge their positions in an uncertain geopolitical environment, but they remain far from being able or willing to replace the United States with China as their primary partner. The visits appear to be driven more by a desire to demonstrate options and reduce immediate tensions than by any fundamental realignment of strategic priorities. From Beijing's perspective, these visits serve important objectives, regardless of the specific agreements that emerge from them. They support a narrative that China is actively constructing about its role in the world, a narrative that positions the country as a stable and reliable partner in contrast to what Beijing portrays as the unpredictable and demanding approach of the current U.S. administration. Chinese officials and state media have emphasized the contrast between what they describe as chaotic tariff policies and growing lists of threats and demands emanating from Washington, and what they present as China's consistent and constructive approach to international engagement. Each visit by a Western leader provides material that can be used to reinforce this messaging, both domestically within China and internationally. Yet the economic fundamentals underlying these diplomatic engagements reveal significant limitations to what China can offer Western economies seeking to diversify their trade relationships. The deals that Western powers have secured during such visits come in the context of deeper integration with a country that recorded a trade surplus the size of the entire Dutch economy last year, but where domestic consumption remains notably weak. China's economy continues to be heavily oriented toward exports, and its own producers struggle to find adequate demand within the domestic market. This structural reality shapes what is available to foreign partners seeking meaningful economic cooperation. The specific outcomes of Starmer's visit illustrate both the possibilities and the constraints of engagement with China at this moment. The visa-free access for British travelers and the reduced tariffs on whiskey represent tangible benefits that will be welcomed by relevant constituencies in Britain. The AstraZeneca investment commitment signals continued confidence from a major British corporation in the Chinese market. However, on matters of geopolitical tension, the visit appears to have yielded little beyond what has been characterized as frank dialogue. The issues that create friction between Britain and China, including China's increasingly assertive stance regarding Taiwan, its strengthened relationship with Russia following the invasion of Ukraine, and the ongoing crackdown on rights in Hong Kong, Britain's former colony, were discussed, but no breakthroughs have been announced. British and American politicians who have criticized Starmer's decision to visit China have raised concerns about espionage and human rights violations, accusations that Beijing has rejected. The Canadian experience offers a parallel example of both the opportunities and the risks associated with this diplomatic approach. Mark Carney departed China with expectations that Beijing would reduce or eliminate tariffs on Canadian exports, including canola, lobsters, crabs, and peas. However, this development immediately triggered a response from the Trump administration, which threatened to impose 100% tariffs on Canadian goods and warned Ottawa about the dangers of allowing Chinese electric vehicles access to North American markets. Even before Starmer completed his visit to Beijing, President Trump issued a warning to Britain about the risks of conducting business with China, a statement that came shortly after the British Prime Minister had publicly emphasized the economic benefits of improving relations with Beijing. The economic data underlying China's trade relationships with Western countries reveals a pattern that raises questions about the sustainability of increased integration. China's imports in the previous year remained essentially flat at $2.6 trillion, and these imports were predominantly composed of energy and commodities sourced from emerging markets rather than manufactured goods from Western economies. In contrast, China's trade surplus increased by 1/5 to reach a record $1.2 trillion, as Chinese manufacturers responded to U.S. tariff measures by expanding their presence in virtually every other market around the world, often at the expense of domestic producers in those markets. The trajectory suggested by current trends is striking. At the current pace of growth, China's trade surplus is on track to reach a size roughly equivalent to the $3 trillion French economy by the year 2030, and could approach the scale of the $5 trillion German economy by 2033. The trade flows between China and its Western partners reflect this imbalance in stark terms. China's exports to the European Union increased by 8.4% in the previous year, while imports from the EU decreased by 0.4%. China shipped 7.8% more goods to Britain while purchasing 4.7% less from British suppliers. With Canada, the pattern was even more pronounced, with Chinese sales growing 3.2%, while purchases from Canada plunged by 10.4%. These figures highlight a fundamental challenge for countries attempting to balance their relationships between Washington and Beijing. For nations seeking to protect or expand their own manufacturing sectors, substantially increasing trade integration with China presents considerable risks. The structure of China's economy, with its enormous export capacity and relatively limited import appetite for manufactured goods from advanced economies, means that deeper trade ties may primarily benefit Chinese producers while exposing Western industries to intensified competition. According to assessments from former officials at the International Monetary Fund who have specialized in China's economy, the country does not provide a safe alternative for nations attempting to mitigate the economic disruption caused by U.S. tariff policies. Nevertheless, some analysts suggest that securing major trade victories with China may not be the primary objective, or even a realistic goal, for countries such as Britain or Canada at the present moment. The value of these visits may lie more in the resetting of relationships that had deteriorated significantly in recent years than in the specific economic agreements that emerge from them. The previous decline in relations between Western countries and China had exposed critical dependencies on Chinese supply chains, dependencies that became painfully apparent during various disruptions. China's use of trade countermeasures in response to Western restrictions had served to widen rather than narrow the trade imbalances between China and its Western partners, creating additional vulnerabilities for countries seeking to reduce their exposure to Chinese economic leverage. What remains unclear at this stage is how the various parties involved will navigate the tensions inherent in this evolving situation. The visits by Starmer and Carney have been characterized by experts on Europe-China relations as a significant symbolic victory for Beijing, providing material for Chinese officials to promote their narrative of growing international support. However, these same experts emphasize that what is occurring should not be interpreted as a fundamental pivot toward China as a replacement for the United States in the strategic calculations of Western powers. Instead, the visits appear to reflect an effort to reduce immediate tensions with Beijing while maintaining the core elements of Western alliances, even as those alliances experience strain. The reality that no country wishes to find itself in open conflict with both major powers simultaneously shapes the diplomatic choices being made by governments around the world. The calculation appears to be that engagement with China, even if it produces limited concrete benefits in the near term, is preferable to a posture of confrontation on multiple fronts. The question that remains unanswered is whether this approach will prove sustainable as the structural tensions in the global economy continue to intensify, and as the rivalry between Washington and Beijing shows no signs of diminishing. As this situation continues to develop, several key uncertainties persist. The durability of the agreements reached during these visits has yet to be tested. The response from the Trump administration to Britain's engagement with China will become clearer in the coming days and weeks. The reactions from other Western allies observing these developments will help determine whether additional countries follow the path charted by Britain and Canada, or whether the risks and limitations become sufficiently apparent to discourage similar initiatives. The degree to which China is willing or able to offer more substantial economic concessions to Western partners seeking to diversify their relationships remains to be seen. What can be stated with confidence at this moment is that British Prime Minister Keir Starmer has concluded a visit to China that has produced specific, confirmed outcomes in the form of visa arrangements, tariff reductions, and corporate investment commitments. The visit has occurred within a broader pattern of diplomatic engagement between Western leaders and Chinese officials that has accelerated since the beginning of the current U.S. administration's second term. Beijing is presenting these visits as validation of its position in the global order and as evidence of China's reliability, in contrast to what it characterizes as American unpredictability. Western capitals are using these engagements to signal that alternatives exist to exclusive reliance on the United States, while simultaneously attempting to manage the risks inherent in deeper integration with an economy structured very differently from their own. The information available at this time confirms these basic elements of the situation. The full implications of these developments will only become apparent as events continue to unfold, and as the various parties involved make subsequent decisions about how to respond to the choices made by others. What is certain is that the visit just concluded represents a moment of significance in the ongoing evolution of international relations, a moment that reflects both the opportunities and the constraints facing middle powers attempting to navigate between the world's two largest economies in an era of intensifying great power competition. This marks the latest confirmed development in a rapidly evolving diplomatic landscape, where traditional assumptions about alliance structures and economic partnerships are being tested in real time.